Live from Fairfax, it's the Inside Scoop, Virginia. All the news Virginians want to know. Here's your host.
Good evening and welcome to the Virginia Politics Hour. My name is Bettina Lawton and I'm your host tonight. And we have with us Brian Moran. Brian's been with us before. He is the chairman of the Democratic Party of Virginia. So welcome, Brian, to the show again.
Nice to be back, Bettina.
So much has happened since we last saw you. It was in, I think, late October or thereabouts.
Well, it was actually just after the election.
Oh, okay. It was later than I thought. So, well, since then, we've had, I guess on Friday, the redistricting plan. The big issue we always had was we didn't do our congressional redistricting. Supposedly, we were supposed to do it last year. It didn't get done, and now they've just redone it. What's the status of all that? What's the change?
Well, there's an argument to be made that it was mandated by our Constitution to do it last year. There's a shall that says it shall be done in that year of the redistricting. So, though this year, in 2012, we returned to the issue, and a bill was passed that essentially protects the incumbents. It's been referred to as the Incumbent Protection Redistricting Plan. And from a Democratic Party perspective, we're disappointed because if you maintain the current makeup of the congressional composition, it's 8-3, 8 Republicans, 3 Democrats. We believe the state is far more purple than that. As we know, in 2008, with Barack Obama making history in Virginia, winning Virginia for the first time since 1964, we also won congressional seats. We were up 6-5. We won in the 5th district with Tom Perriello, the 2nd district with Glenn Nye, and then the 9th district with Rick Boucher. So, in addition to our Northern Virginian, Bobby Scott. So we had 6-5. With this plan, it's going to be difficult to get to a 6-5 plan again. Personally, I've always been one in favor of a bipartisan or nonpartisan redistricting commission.
Well, when Governor McDonnell ran, didn't he advocate for that?
He advocated for a bold transportation plan as well, and we haven't seen that.
Haven't seen that either, so I guess we can't rely.
But he did, and it's very disappointing. He claimed he would support such a commission. He did appoint a commission, actually, but it ended up being lip service because they came up with a plan. The legislature rejected, and of course the governor rejected it as well because he hasn't put it in place. So we're going to end up with a plan that protects the incumbents. And one of the subtexts of this is the minority representation in Congress. Virginia has about a 22% African-American population, yet we only have one congressman, Bobby Scott, from the 3rd Congressional District down in the Newport News area, 1 out of 11. Now, that's obviously not 22%.
Right. So,
that's a subtext of all of this. The overwhelming issue is that is it fair that politicians pick their constituents as opposed to constituents picking their representative?
Right, exactly.
But the subtext of this, and one that is important, is the lack of minority representation and should there be better representation. And the plan that the Democrats put forward in the Senate of Virginia was one that would have redistricted the 4th Congressional District, which is down in the southern border of North Carolina, moves up through Petersburg towards Richmond. If that was maneuvered in a little different way, you would have seen a more competitive race and more minority representation. But unfortunately, that's for naught. The Republicans passed the Congressional Redistricting Plan on Friday by a vote of 20-19. And it goes on to the governor, and all expectations are that the governor will sign it.
So all the Democrats in the Senate who were there that day voted against it?
Voted against it, yes.
Now, that plan has to go to the Department of Justice, doesn't it, for preclearance? We're a segregated state history that you've got to get preclearance. What do you think the chances are of that? Since that was the big thing that was in the papers when this passed, was that we've got this big minority population and you don't really, except for one district, you have no real opportunity to have another minority elected.
The lawyers that deal in this area that have weighed in feel it probably will be approved, but we'll have to wait and see. But we can't say for sure, but hopefully I wish the legislators had just done the right thing in the first place, not relied on the Department of Justice or the courts, but rather the legislators should have redistricted in a more fair and just manner.
Because somebody filed a lawsuit back in December. I can't remember who it was, but someone filed a lawsuit saying Virginia didn't do what it was required by its Constitution, and that's
right.
sort of
There's
just
still
sitting
the
out
issue
there.
that you're supposed to have redistricted in 2011, and it says shall.
Right.
And it's obviously very curious to me that the Republicans who claim to be the party of rules and laws,
Strict
particularly when it comes to immigration, you hear the presidential candidate say, well, if you broke the law immigrating here illegally, then you should be kicked out of the country, even despite you living here 25 years and obeying the law. But when it comes to either getting on the ballot in Virginia, which they're suing about because they didn't follow the law, or in this case where the Constitution says shall, they're interpreting, well, it doesn't really mean shall, it means maybe. And that's just not, in my estimation, a true constitutional interpretation of that of the word shall. So we'll see. I think there's a good case to be made there as well. But all of this thing, it takes money, resources, time to pursue in the courts. But we'll pursue those efforts, or at least we'll evaluate those opportunities.
Well, let's talk for just a second about the Democratic primary. You referenced the fact that there was a lawsuit that's, I guess, since been dismissed by the judge, where the Republicans claimed, oh golly, the rules in Virginia are just too hard, and we couldn't get them all. And the Republican, yes, for the Republicans. So now we only have 2 in Virginia. As I understand where we are right now, we have Mitt Romney and we have Ron Paul. That's the only 2. The primary is in March
6th.
And then I also saw recently that the issue about the loyalty oath has been withdrawn. The Republicans, for those of our viewers who may not know, wanted a person voting in their primary to sign a loyalty oath that said, if I'm voting here, I promise I'll vote for whoever the Republican winner is in November. And they decided they weren't going to do that anymore. Now, how did that all happen? They suddenly, I mean, I thought it was a terrible idea, but...
Well, then it all stems from the first is that we don't have party registration in Virginia. So they're open primaries. So Republicans can vote in Democratic primaries and Democrats can vote in Republican primaries if they so choose. There's nothing illegal about it, and you won't be prevented from doing so. And so when the Republicans have a primary March 6th, Democrats do not, because we have President Barack Obama. And so they're worried that, well, a lot of Democrats will come in and try to skew the results. I'm not sure who they'd vote for in this. The current makeup now, I don't know what the Democrats would do with respect to who we want or would or wouldn't want. But, and so the Republicans said, well, let's have a loyalty oath. You sign it, and you say you have to support Ron Paul or Mitt Romney in November if they're the nominee. They've since backed away from that, which I think is appropriate. And so it actually stems from that open primary season. A lot of the Republicans didn't get on the ballot. Newt Gingrich, who was actually a resident of Virginia, lives in McLean, was unable to get the 10,000 signatures and get his name on the ballot.
Well, that must be a relief, though, to Bob McDonnell, because he wants to be a vice president, as I understand it, and the president and the vice president can't come from the same state. And of course, we know Bob McDonnell just endorsed Romney, so that kind of helps his hopes along.
Well, Virginia's a battleground state. We as Democrats love the fact that we are a battleground state. I mean, all of our work, our effort, our phone calls, the door knocking matters. And so it makes us very, very relevant. We're excited. And on the flip side, of course, it's a battleground state for Republicans now. So Bob McDonnell obviously would be an attractive candidate to try to win Virginia. Ultimately, I think it's the top of the ticket that makes the difference, and we're very solid there, and I think we're going to be fine. Interestingly enough, Rick Santorum is making that same argument now this week because he won in Pennsylvania. Of course, the last time he ran, he lost against Bob Casey, but he has won in Pennsylvania, so he's making the case, well, I can win in the battleground state. I can attract Reagan Democrats in Pennsylvania and Ohio. Those are some of the other states that are going to be swing states this fall. So both of those cases are being made, and in the meantime, us Democrats, we just need to get ready. We need to get organized, and so when they do eventually nominate their candidate, that we're going to be ready. And I'm convinced we will be here in Virginia. It's exciting to be a battleground state, but I'm convinced we'll turn it blue again in November.
So the Republicans can rest easy. The Democratic Party in Virginia, we're not responding to the calls on the blogs and on Facebook and places that say that we ought to organize some kind of a Operation Chaos. Remember, they had that with Hillary and Barack in 2008, that there should be the Republicans were going to swoop down in and vote in our primary. And of course, I don't think they actually did. But I saw the Democrats sort of saying, hey, you know, I'm not doing anything in March. I could vote in their primary. Why don't we organize? We only have 2 people. And it's kind of like, how do you...
I would encourage Democrats to organize for Democrats. Let's make sure we're ready for the fall. We have congressional races. We have great candidates running for Congress. Tremendous United States Senate candidate in Tim Kaine. They're looking for volunteers organizing. So I'd ask my fellow Democrats, let's organize for our own candidates.
Exactly.
And get ready for the fall.
I'm totally with you on that, actually. Let's go back to the Senate for just a couple of minutes. I heard something. I was at a town hall meeting yesterday morning.
Good for you.
And they were talking about the Senate and the 2020 tie, and that Bill Bolling, as the lieutenant governor, can't vote on budget issues. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay, so...
Well, he's not supposed to. I mean, that's one of the arguments. Initially, right after the election, when it was 2020, we were on your show, and I said, well, the lieutenant governor is limited in what he can vote on. But the Republicans at that time came out in full bluster and said, oh, we have complete control. I'm going to vote on these issues. He has since drawn back, to his credit, he's since drawn back and said there are issues that I cannot vote on. The Constitution says those votes are reserved for the duly elected members of the state Senate, of which our Lieutenant Governor Bill Bolling is not. So I'm pleased that he recognizes that. But there are indeed issues that he shouldn't be voting on, and we'll see how this all plays out throughout the session.
Well, is the budget notion that in order to pass, you have to have a budget in Virginia, it has to be balanced.
And it has to be balanced.
In order to do that, the Democrats, some Democrats, have got to cross over to vote if Bill Bolling can't vote. So is that, from your perspective, sort of as a whole political analyst, observer kind of thing, is that where their real leverage this year comes from? Because we don't share anything anymore. We're not equal on, I think there's some minor committee or two where there's actually an equal number of Republicans and Democrats. But otherwise, we're just completely shut out. Is that budget concept of saying if the Democrats can hold together, is that really where the ability to get some things done happens? Yes,
and the Constitution was written in that way in a recognition of just how important the budget is. The budget really is the moral document. It reflects our priorities, whether it be in education, economic development, helping those who lack sustenance, and helping establishing the social safety net and so forth. So clearly the Democrats and Republicans do have differences over those issues.
Okay.
And so you'll see that play out. It's going to be a very interesting session. The Democrats are ready to fight for education, ready to fight for those issues that reflect democratic values. And we'll be ready to fight those values.
All right, and we're going to be right back to talk about a couple of other issues with Brian Moran. Stay with us.
Listen to smoke before you give it a try. Only you. Don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Cause there's nothing very funny about rip-off life. Nothing very nice on a homeless mind. So if a gorgeous force is what you desire, don't play with matches. Don't play with fire.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Fire.
Why don't you just wash your car at home?
When I wash my car, everything runs down the street and down into the storm drains. With all the chemicals in the soaps and waxes, the last thing I want to do is poison my own drinking water. At least here, it's all contained and recycled on site. That's why I also take my car in for oil changes instead of doing it myself. I might take a chance on spilling stuff. You know what the best part is?
What?
More time to kick back and watch the game.
How far would you go to protect the planet?
I want you to build an ark.
Here we go. Okay, that's good. Oh, okay. Ow! Oh!
Maybe there's another way.
People, the flood is imminent!
Is it too much to ask for a little precipitation?
Go to fightglobalwarming.com to find out what you and your community can do to reduce global warming pollution.
Somewhere around the world, there are men and women of the armed forces risking their lives, helping rebuild communities.
Here again, the Inside Scoop, Virginia.
Welcome back. I'm Bettina Lawton, and we are here for a continuing conversation with Brian Moran. He is the chair of the Democratic Party in Virginia. And Brian, I wanted to talk to you about the voter suppression bills that are in. We saw a flood of them suddenly come in. I saw an update that just kept listing them page after page after page. Some of them are the sort of the standard voter ID kind of laws, which people say, if you're going to vote, you need to show proof that you're actually Brian Moran and this is where you live, and you should be able to do that. Democrats oppose those bills. Why?
Well, because you said it. You're describing it as voter suppression bills.
Well, that's because I'm a Democrat.
The proponents of these bills would not refer to it as suppression.
No, they say it's an anti-fraud bill. Yeah. They claim there's apparently some big fraud going on.
Yeah, it would be nice to see the fraud proven before we go take the draconian steps that some of these bills call for. And I think it's right to call them voter suppression. This is a fundamental right. Our whole entire democracy depends on citizenship, and one of the important parts of citizenship is to vote. It's an obligation. And as it is, not enough people vote already. I mean, 50%, and even in a presidential election, I mean, we just had a very important election this fall, and it was tough to get 35% of the people voting. So the last thing we should be doing is putting more barriers in the way of people voting. Right. So I think it's appropriate that you call them voter suppression bills. If anything, we should be expanding it. We should be allowing people to early vote until a fraud is proven. I mean, obviously, we don't want fraud at the voter box. That's important to stamp out. But it just hasn't been demonstrated that that's occurring. For instance, the voter ID bill, where you actually have to have a picture identification. Most people have driver's license, but not everybody has a driver's license. And so then how are they going to get the voter the picture to the vote? So I think people need to think through these issues. And again, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. There's a whole lot of other issues to deal with here. Mm-hmm. And if you were a cynic, you could argue, well, is this all about November and the Barack Obama vote? Right. We saw an enormous turnout amongst young people and minorities in 2008 that propelled Barack Obama to presidency. We want to duplicate that again in 12. And so the cynic in me would say, oh, is these bills all about that? Let's hope they're not. Let's say, but if anything, we should be expanding and replacing barriers in terms of voting and make it easier. So.
Well, I think it's interesting because I read some studies, and there have been these kinds of bills in other states. And so I don't remember if this is a Virginia analysis or it was a different state. But they looked and said, if you implement a government-issued photo ID, the people that you do affect are young people a lot, because many of them do have driver's license, some of them don't. If you go to a state school and you have a student ID, that could work. But if you go to private colleges, and we've got a number of those in Virginia, those aren't state issues, those don't work. And the same thing, someone came up with an amazing example of an older person who has always voted, and it's a person down in sort of the Richmond area, and this came up in a debate last fall, where the person had always voted, every single year for 30, 40 years they have voted. And now they're older. They can't drive anymore, so they've lost their driver's license. They have never traveled outside of the United States, so they don't have a passport. Right. There's no picture on your Social Security card. And so it was like, well, how does this person then get to vote? So it is young people, it is minorities, but it's also a lot of older folks who may not be well enough to drive, but are certainly well enough to be able to vote. And now you're saying to them, you can't, you don't have the necessary documentation after all these years. Just is like an incredibly unfair burden. And I understand.
And I don't think that's actually unusual.
No, I don't.
Situation, that's could cover a number of people. Yeah. And again, there's so many issues to deal with that. Why are we spending so much time on this issue? The fraud has not been revealed. Right. And until it is, I think our time is better spent, and the time of our legislators is better spent on the economy and education and transportation and issues that affect our everyday lives.
Yeah, not a solution looking for a problem.
There you go. Well said.
The other one that I found interesting was proof of citizenship.
Yeah.
There is some bill in the legislature, not that you have to show you're an actual citizen of the United States. And it goes back to issues of to register, and then you got to bring it again when you vote. And I thought, what proves that? I mean, I remember, my mother who, when she needed to get a Social Security card, when it became mandatory in the 60s, she went looking for a birth certificate, and they couldn't find one. And because it just wasn't something that people naturally got back in those days. And again, this affects senior people. And she had never traveled outside of the United States until the day she died. She'd never gone out of the United States.
It's interesting about the proof of citizenship. I mean, look at what our own president has had to do to prove his citizenship, and some people still don't believe it.
Exactly.
So to suggest that we're going to go through that process for every voter in Virginia to show proof is, again, it's a solution in search of a problem.
Yeah,
and,
I saw that one.
I would discourage going down this path. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you another one, because this one, and some of these bills you look and they're put in by people who are from very Republican parts of the state.
Yeah.
But I noticed that Tim Hugo, who is up here, he's got some districts actually in Fairfax County, and he put in a very strange bill, and I don't know if you've heard of this, but I thought it was very strange. If you send in an absentee ballot by mail, and you don't fill it out right, and I understand there are all kinds of things, you've got to put your address here, and if you put it someplace else, it doesn't count, and if you don't, there's a bazillion reasons why it may not work. He put in a bill that said, if your absentee ballot is rejected, they can't tell you until after the polls are already closed. So you have no ability to go and fix it. And I saw that and was like, okay, now this is bizarre. One would think if what you want to do is promote participation, you want citizens voting, if they're going through the absentee ballots and they can tell from the outside of your envelope you didn't fill something in, why wouldn't you call people? That doesn't make any sense to me. And that's from a relatively Northern Virginia legislator. I'm not aware of any problems with that. I'm not aware of why somebody shouldn't be notified. Am I missing something? Is this a big issue someplace?
It doesn't come immediately to mind. Oftentimes legislators hear from their constituents. It's this one particular constituent had an issue. Well, maybe this case it's someone from the electoral board, or I don't know. I don't know. Again, though, underlying this is we should be encouraging voting. We should be taking down barriers. We should be making it easier, not harder. And we should encourage more participation at the ballot box, not discourage it.
Well, I do want to say, give sort of a shout out to my Senator Janet Howell, who put in a bill to try and make it easier to do the absentee voting, which some states have it. You can vote absentee on Sundays, you can vote absentee for long periods of time, which enables people who are working all the time to be able to vote at their convenience.
Well, we have in Northern Virginia, and Janet's well aware of this, a lot of her constituents, if you don't vote in the morning, you're not going to get back in time at night to vote because of traffic. Heaven forbid there's an accident or foul weather, they'll never get back on time. And so we have tried to expand the excuse voting. Right now, it's actually not early voting. It's only with an excuse can you early vote. And we've always tried to expand those. And for those who work in D.C., you can say you're out of state, and so you can early vote, is in my interpretation.
Oh, yeah.
So, and really, if you're in D.C., and if you don't vote in the morning on the way to work, and you're risking voting at night.
I remember one of those a number of years ago with a big election, and there was an ice storm during the day.
Well, with the presidential primaries in 2008, there was an ice storm in February, and
we had people pounding on the door after we'd closed the polling place, trying to get in, and I was standing on the inside going, I can't help you. It's past 7.
And we still had a big turnout. Just going back to the presidential election of 2008 versus now, and the excitement around the Democratic candidates. I mean, we had 2 extremely qualified candidates, electrifying Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, and people got out and voted like we haven't seen. And it's interesting, as you watch the Republican primaries in Iowa, it didn't increase much more than what it was in 2008. And you'd think some disaffected independents would be voting in their primary. That's what the Republican claimed, that all these independents are disaffected, they're upset at Barack Obama. But Mitt Romney, I think he received 8 votes less than he did in 2008.
Oh my
he did in
gosh.
12. So,
Oh my gosh.
you know, I think they lack that excitement that.
You know, and you thought, I think when in the early stages when you had those debates and you had all these people up there and everybody was watching them. And so I thought, well, maybe they're going to get some excitement. And then I realized that it was a form of reality TV. It was who was going to mess up, who was going to have that moment, like, you know, Rick Perry with his, there are three, what was that third one, you know, and all of these kind of, you know, Mitt Romney with, you know, I'll bet you $10,000 for whatever his thing was. And I realized a lot of people were watching it because they were so appalled by what they were seeing. But they haven't seemed to generate any kind of real positive enthusiasm.
Right. I think there's an enthusiasm gap. You know, despite what people are saying, you know, the press wants they want a good clash come November. They want a close race. But if you look at the numbers, there's an enthusiasm gap right now. And while the president is relaxed and singing in New York,
that was so great.
the Republicans are battling each other and you know, on to Florida now. So I think we're in a good spot. And they have 2 more debates this week before Florida. You saw what Newt Gingrich did with his debate, but blaming the press for his infidelities will only last so long. I think that he's going to have a short
from a man
short boost
who
from that.
led the effort to get rid of President Clinton based on his issues, for him to turn around and say, oh, well, mine, not so much. You know, you don't get to say anything to me. Really? Because I'm thinking you're a liar, okay? You could say, hey, he called Romney a liar. I could call him a liar. That's how it works in this world. But I think it is pretty funny that they have had a different person winning every place now. It's like nobody, they have not generated that real enthusiasm.
I've always assumed that eventually it will be Mitt Romney.
Right.
When I watch the debates, I mean, he appears to be the more presidential candidate. However, there's obviously the Republicans just they are not warming up to Mitt Romney. And so, you know, first it was Rick Santorum, and then of course Mitt Romney won New Hampshire bordering Massachusetts, then South Carolina now with Newt, and now we're down to Florida. So obviously, you know, he just can't get beyond the reluctance of the Republicans to embrace him. And so it does promise to be continuing to be, now I guess it's Rick Santorum's turn to win Florida.
Everybody gets one, right? And then we start figuring it all out again. Well, I want to thank you.
Maybe the Florida Democrats can take care of that for us and Operation Chaos.
Operation Chaos in Florida.
For Rick Santorum.
That would be fun. Well, I want to thank you for coming and joining us.
For having me on.
We will have you on throughout the rest of the year leading up so that we can keep abreast of what's happening.
Well, let's have me back to talk about the convention we're going to have for the very first time we have having the state convention in Fairfax County in June. So it promises to be a really exciting convention. Great.
All right. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.
Too many women get hit by their boyfriends and husbands. Too many women are pressured into having unprotected sex. Half of the people in the world living with AIDS are women. It doesn't have to be this way. Together, we can change this reality. Let's strive for a world free of violence.
At Volunteers of America, we don't just give kids a way to stay off the streets. We give them the tools they need to reach their full potential. We don't just help the elderly receive needed care. We help them live life to the fullest. We don't just provide food for homeless individuals and families. We provide job training and placement so they can buy groceries. Volunteers of America is a national organization that for over 100 years has provided programs and services that allow people to overcome their challenges to become vital members of their community. At Volunteers of America, we don't just help people, we help people help themselves. Find out how you can support the programs that are working in your community. Contact Volunteers of America today.
Here again, the Inside Scoop, Virginia.
Welcome back. I'm Bettina Lawton, the host of Inside Scoop Virginia, and we have switched guests. With me now is Tim O'Brien. He is the head of the Public Advocacy for Voter Protection Project for the League of Women Voters of the U.S., And I might have just given him a promotion, but he really deserves it. I've talked with him, and he really knows his stuff. So we're going to talk with Tim about the voter suppression laws more broadly, because while Virginia has introduced a bunch of them this General Assembly session, other states beat us to the punch. And we're going to talk to Tim about that, some cases that have come up, some issues about cost, and just sort of try and fill us in and enlighten us in Virginia as to what we can be expecting in the future. So welcome to the show, Tim.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate you coming. Let's talk about the existing laws, because as we said in the earlier segment with Brian Moran, the Republicans, and I know the League is nonpartisan, but the Republicans introduced these things and they say it's anti-fraud. So most people think that there is no existing law that covers this, but that's not right. There's actually usually laws on the books?
There is federal law on the books right now. So if you go in and you impersonate someone in the polls, it's a $10,000 fine and 5 years in prison that you would get for that. And oftentimes people do talk about voter impersonation and losing their votes, et cetera. But when you really look at the evidence that's out there right now, there is no evidence that supports the fact that we would need to take such draconian measures as the photo identification bills that are being introduced. The Department of Justice during the Bush administration from 2002 to 2004 to 2007 did an intensive investigation across the country looking at voter irregularities that occurred, and they could not find one instance of voter impersonation in the polls that they prosecuted at all during that period of time. And on average, you've got a chance of being struck by lightning twice being struck by lightning than you do of having someone go to the polls and pretend that they're you.
Wow, that hardly seems worthwhile to spend all of this time and angst on voter ID laws if there's no real problem there. That's been done. I hadn't realized that the Bush administration had actually done that investigation, so it does kind of say there's not really a problem here. Now, but what is the problem with the voter ID laws? I know there have been some enacted in other states. What's the actual problem when they're getting implemented?
Right. Well, there's several problems that exist. So I'll just start out by saying that we've seen just a wave of new voter suppression laws that are being introduced and passed across the country. Before 2011, there were only 2 states that had photo identification laws at the polls, and that was Georgia and Indiana. In 2011, we had 8 states that actually introduced the laws and passed them, and so we have 8 new states that are there. Oftentimes people believe that I have an ID, therefore everyone else has identification. You have to do it when you go to the bank or all these other instances where they can think of doing it. But the reality is about 21 million Americans don't have the necessary identification that they need to vote. And so getting that identification creates new barriers to individuals that have been voting all of their life without an issue. For instance, if you're going to the polls and you need to get a photo identification, the problem isn't just getting that identification, but it's getting the underlying documentation that you need to get the photo identification. So in many cases, you need to get a birth certificate, and if you've been married and or your name has changed, you need to get your marriage license as well. And there's costs associated with that. There's $30 to get a birth certificate if you were born in the state of New York. It could take up to 6 to 8 weeks in order for you to get that birth certificate, and that creates an issue if it's closer to the election, if you've had your identification stolen, plus the cost of $30 for a birth certificate and an additional cost for a marriage license. Many people simply can't afford that these days.
Well, and all of those seems, as you've mentioned, sort of delays inherent in it. It's not like you can just walk down and say, okay, give me a picture ID. Here's my gas bill that shows this is where I'm living. You've actually got to go back and try and find those other IDs. Now, do the people, though, I thought there was some rule that the states had to pay for these voter ID laws to be implemented, because otherwise it's kind of a barrier, kind of like the old poll taxes that were ruled illegal. So doesn't the state have to pay for all of this?
The states, because of the Supreme Court case that happened in Indiana, the states need to be able to cover the cost of the photo identification that if it's needed for voting purposes. And that it can be a great cost to the states at a time when there's fiscal crisis that are going on across the country and budget deficits. To be adding millions of dollars onto that to fix a problem that actually doesn't exist seems a bad choice of how to govern.
And what kind of costs have they done studies that say, I mean, you said Georgia and Indiana have it, for example. Have there been studies that say it's going to cost you $1 million to do this? I mean, how much are we really talking in terms of money?
Like the two states that have been out there so far have been Indiana, that we can actually take a hard look at. And actually the state of Iowa was looking at implementing voter photo identification laws there. So they sent a bipartisan commission to Indiana to interview and talk to local and state election officials to see how much it costs to implement these bills. And they found that over a 4-year period of time, it was about $12.3 million to implement. So a little over $4 million a year to implement it. Oftentimes you'll hear legislators say, well, you know, there's going to be an initial cost right away because people are going to be getting their free identification. And what they found in Indiana, that actually wasn't the case. The cost actually stayed pretty steady throughout that 4-year period of time for them. So there wasn't a peak in the cost and then it went down for the state. It actually continued to be about the same.
That is kind of counterintuitive, because I would have assumed it was, as they said, it would all be upfront cost as everybody sort of swooped in and got it.
Right, but oftentimes people move either within the state or into the state, or there's name changes and people that are getting married, et cetera, or have been divorced. And so again, they go in for their ID, they have to get that, and they have to be for free. You know, oftentimes this doesn't cover the cost if there's a lawsuit that goes on with the state, or training the poll workers and the election officials on what the new rules are and how to implement them and so forth.
Wow, so that does not seem, if you're trying to balance your budget, saying I've now got to come up with, you know, $8 million, $10 million for a law that doesn't seem to be fixing any real problem, is not perhaps the wisest fiscal move.
The priority isn't there.
It's not there at all. What is in terms of out there nationally, what do you see when these kinds of laws get implemented? You said 21 million people don't have the right ID?
Right. A survey that was done by the Brennan Center for Justice looked at and did a survey across the country, and they found about 11% of the population doesn't have the ID that you actually need in order to vote. It's important to recognize that any old photo ID isn't acceptable at the polls. For instance, in Texas, you can use your concealed carry permit ID, but you can't use your university ID that is also provided by the state. Really? It's a way of targeting, you know, and making sure that students aren't as likely. They have that extra barrier that they have to go to as well.
So does everybody just go then get a concealed carry permit in Texas? I mean, what do you have to go do? You then rely like on driver's licenses? Or?
It's mostly driver's licenses that are there and/or passports that individuals need to show at the polls. And so, you know, and oftentimes people that don't drive anymore. So that tends to be, you know, elderly individuals, individuals that live in the inner cities, poor populations that are there, students also that may have, you know, have a car at home but don't have one on campus, you know, in the state that they've actually come from, but when they live in a separate state, et cetera. So the identification just simply isn't as available that's there for the individuals.
Wow, that is kind of like the demographic that says Democratic. The olders, the youngs. I think we talked about disabled people are also folks who sort of fall into that category. Right.
So again, those individuals that are less likely to drive and not have the identification that's needed.
Now, there's also some laws about citizenship, I think, as another way of saying if you want to vote, the driver's license may not be sufficient. You've got to show birth certificates or passports or something. Is that also a common kind of law?
We're seeing that legislation pop up across the country as well. Before 2011, it was just the state of Georgia that required that, and this is at the point of registration. So when you go in to register to vote. Currently, you take an oath basically that says I am a U.S. citizen, and et cetera. But these laws then are saying that you have to come in with, again, a birth certificate or a passport or a tribal ID or naturalization papers that are from there. And again, it goes after the same issue. It's the same people that they're kind of targeting here, where many times, especially women in the South, elderly women who weren't born at home, or were born at home and don't have a birth certificate that they can actually go to and bring to be able to prove it. And it also brings up another issue that's here, and that is in Indiana what they were finding is that catch-22. Individuals will go to get their identification card and they'll say, well, show us your birth certificate. And say, well, I don't have my birth certificate. And they'll go get the birth certificate and they'll say, well, the only way we can give you your birth certificate is if you have a photo identification. And so they're stuck in this catch-22 where they literally cannot get the identification that's needed because the law is set up in such a way that it's not possible.
Well, but what's the solution for that? You just are disenfranchising these
Basically,
people?
you're disenfranchised. Right.
There's no Have they fixed this? I mean, how long have they known about this? Are they fixing it?
When the commission went in from Iowa, went into Indiana to talk to them about it, that was one of the things that the state and the local election officials said that needed to be addressed. But to my knowledge, it hasn't been addressed either in Indiana or in other states that are coming up with this issue. We've seen this pop up both in Wisconsin and examples in Kansas.
Wow, that just doesn't seem right. There ought to be some way to handle that.
Right. There's some instances. There was a veteran in Wisconsin who went to get his ID. He had his Veterans Affairs card with a photo on it. He had a photo ID from the county of Milwaukee, and he had some other, like his utility bill, etc. And they said, well, without a birth certificate, we can't give you the ID. So he wrote actually a check for $20, sent it in to the vital records, and when it came back, it actually had the wrong name on it. It was a different name, which is also is a common thing for people. I was saying earlier, my mother name is Joanne, but on her birth certificate it's Johanna because of her German roots that were there. And I never knew that until recently. And so if it isn't the same name and it doesn't match, then they actually can't. And so this individual who was a veteran who actually, fought for us and for our freedoms and our right to vote, is now put in a position where the only way that he can vote again is to go to court and ask the court to recognize him for who he is.
Oh my gosh, that's one of those sort of nightmare scenarios where you can't prove you're who you say you are. I mean,
one of those nightmares you can't wake up from, So it's,
well, how can you not take a veteran's photo ID? I mean, that's an official government ID.
It's just not one that's recognized by the law.
So it's not just a government ID.
Correct.
They're actually listing and saying,
specific types
here's
of
what you must have.
Right.
Well, that seems just grossly unfair.
Yes.
And from the perspective of my son, who is a veteran, if you were to say to me, gee, he gets to go and do a couple tours in Iraq for us, but then if you can't produce his birth certificate, we're not going to let him vote, that's just fundamentally wrong.
Yep.
I mean, there's just no other way around that. Right. My golly. Well, I think we're going to be going to a break. I don't hear the music, but it seems to me we're going to be going to a break, so I'm going to make us go to a break. How's that sound? Good. Take control over the whole thing. We are going to go to a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk some more with Tim about other types of voter registration issues and things that we need to watch out for here in Virginia. Stay with us.
Just books at the library.
There's more than just books at the library.
Excuse me.
There's more than just books at the library.
Il y a plus que de livres à la bibliothèque.
Hello. You have a lot of great books here today. You know there's more than just books at the library.
I know.
There's more than just books at the library.
I don't want to be hooked to a machine.
I want all the medical treatment available to me.
I wouldn't want my family to have to make this decision.
My doctor knows what's best for me.
An advance directive is your life on your terms. Talk with your family. Decide what's right for you. Then put it in writing.
Documenting my wishes today means my family won't have to make heart-wrenching decisions later.
To learn more, visit www.putitinwriting.org.
1,200 American youth run away from their homes every day. The National Runaway Switchboard is here to help. 1-800-RUNAWAY. If you are a runaway, thinking about running away from home, or a parent or guardian concerned about issues facing your child, call us 24 hours a day. 1-800-RUNAWAY. In times of crisis, hope is just a phone call away. 1-800-RUNAWAY.
Here again, the Inside Scoop, Virginia.
Welcome back. My name is Bettina Lawton. I'm your host. I want to give you the phone number and the email address that you can use if you have any questions for Tim in our last segment. The phone number is 571-749-1166, and the email is insidescoop@nova.org. And as I promised when we left, we wanted to come back, talk about some voter registration issues, because if you can't get registered, you don't have to worry about a voter ID. You're not in the books, you're not voting.
Right.
So what's going on with voter registration? Because you don't hear a lot about that. You hear a lot of photo ID talk. What's going on with voter registration?
It's another tactic that we're seeing pop up across the country right now, both in legislation that's being introduced and legislation that's being passed. Both in Texas and Florida in 2011, new laws were passed that really put in some very stringent new requirements for organizations like the League of Women Voters, who have gone out and registered voters for the past 70 years across the country. They were so strict in Florida that the state league in Florida has decided that they can't take the risk of registering voters at this point. And so for the second time actually in the several years, they fought back this legislation about 2 years ago. They came to an agreement with the state. And then it was reintroduced again and passed last year. And so it creates felonies, it creates a large amount of financial burdens, both for the individuals who are doing the registration and for the organization that is helping them do the registration.
But if their felonies aren't, I mean, I always think of felonies. Felonies are things like murders and knifing you while I'm robbing you or something. I mean, what are these felonies that they're going to convict you with respect to voter registration?
It usually comes down to not turning in the registration forms in a very short period of time. And so, for instance, there is a high school teacher in Florida who was registering voters. It's part of the process that they go down there, and she had 48 hours to turn them in. She was a little bit later than that 48 hours, and so there's now a fine of $1,000 and looking at some strict things that are going on. So it just makes people less likely to be wanting to take on that, bringing more people into the process, more people into the voting process. You have a much more likely chance of voting if you're registered to vote. You're put on the rolls, and then you tend to be targeted by the parties, and you get the robocalls. You get brought into that process a little bit more on it. And so when you do that, you're more likely to vote. And so it's kind of just one more barrier that is being put up across the country to try and decrease the number of people that are getting to the polls.
Well, are those the kind of things, because again, with a high school teacher registering high school kids, that's the youth demographic.
Mm-hmm.
Has there been any looking, or are the laws just too new, but has there been any looking that says they are uniformly applying these laws so that it's not just you turned in registration forms late and you were registering in minority areas, or young people, or old people, or those things that are considered classically one party or the other?
Right.
How's the enforcement of that done? Is it impartial? So it may be a completely unjustified kind of penalty or restriction, but how's the actual enforcement of it? Is there anything that looks at that?
It's too early to say at this point on it, because these laws have just been implemented. They were passed last year. They were implemented in the beginning of this year in many cases, and so it's hard for us to take a look at what that implementation will actually happen. And that creates a problem as well for the voter photo identification piece, is that if we're going to challenge these in court, you actually have to find people who have been harmed. And so it means going through 1 or 2 election cycles in order to identify people who simply weren't able to vote, who were eligible to vote, and then trying to find them and work the way back up through the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yeah, that sounds a little tough to try and do,
right.
to find the people who got turned away because they couldn't vote. You really need, that sort of says to the parties on either side, you need to make sure you've got the poll watchers in there who can then identify some of these problems. And I will say, in Virginia, we have an amazing election protection group in Virginia that started years and years ago. I did it when Mark Warner was first running for senator against John Warner, the old Mark, not John campaign. And we've done it every year since, with people watching in different jurisdictions and trying to make sure that the law is being applied evenly. But it's a huge effort. So for people to try and do that, to come up with how is this law affecting people. That's a pretty tough.
It is, yeah. The League of Women Voters actually, in several of the states where voter identification is being implemented, has set up observer programs. In Tennessee, they've got a pretty broad program that'll be implemented for the 2012 general election. And in Wisconsin, during the recall elections that happened both last year and those that'll be happening now, the League has been working with the Government Accountability Board there in setting up observer programs to actually identify where there's problems, individuals that are having issues with it, seeing if poll workers are actually asking everybody the same questions and making sure that they're being asked. It's one of the things in studies that have been done in the past is that where ID is needed, that oftentimes everyone isn't being asked for it. And sometimes that's simply because, it's the next door neighbor and you're a poll worker and of course, it's so-and-so and I know who it is, but you're still required by the law to ask for it and to actually see the ID. And so making sure that it is the same, everyone is treated the same when they go to the polls.
Now, the League of Women Voters is nonpartisan. So when you go in to try and observe and see how things are done, I know in Virginia, if you want to be a poll watcher, you want to go in on election day and sit behind the folks who are checking off the voters, you have to come in and you either have to be a representative of a party or in some cases a representative of the campaign itself. So how does the league actually get in there, or do people not have those same kinds of laws?
Those laws vary from state to state, and so it is taking a look at what you actually can do. And like I said, in Wisconsin, they're actually working with the state government and trying to implement it because they saw the league as the nonpartisan, impartial group that would be out there looking for it, right? And so we're trusted by both sides, and so if there are issues and we can show them, then I think they're more likely to address them in the future.
Yeah, well, I think that's absolutely right because that is the reputation of the league, and so hopefully people will, even in their zest to create some of these laws, hopefully they will continue to rely on the league as sort of the neutral in the whole process. Well, let's talk a little bit about early voting and what's going on with that, because some states, and Virginia's one, we have early voting, but you have to have a reason, and it's not really broad-based. There are some places that have real early voting, and I think like Oregon, you can vote on the internet or something. I mean,
Oregon's mostly all by mail.
Is it really?
Right.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah. And what kind of, do you know what kind of return they get on that?
I don't have the
Because it struck me that was, they got a lot more when people didn't have to go out in a November on a cold day.
Right.
You got more participation.
I just don't know enough about what the statistics coming back on that is.
Yeah. Well, what's going on with the early voting stuff? Because there are things that sort of are voter suppression type stuff in that area as well.
Well, it's kind of the fourth tactic that we're seeing being implemented. One being the photo identification, and the proof of citizenship, and then the voter registration drives, and now it's pulling back on the number of early voting days that are available. And in different states, there's different laws and the criteria. Some have no excuse early voting; you can just go and vote and like that. And others, you have to have an excuse and some proof or whatever that's going there. What we're finding is that I'm trying to remember how many states there were. There were 5 states that have passed laws that actually shorten the early voting period. In 2 of those states, they were shortening specifically on Sundays, and I think that was in Florida, and I'm not sure what the other state was off the top of my head, but where it tends to be minority voters that vote in higher proportions on Sundays. And so they either stopped Sundays altogether or the Sunday before the election, not allowing people to vote at all.
I thought that was interesting, because now that you mentioned the whole Sunday thing, I read something about it where there were certain places in the South where you would go to church. You'd have a huge church, people go to church, and then it would be, come on, we're going to go down and vote. And everybody would just sort of go and vote on Sunday. And by taking away the Sunday voting option, that practice that they've had was stopped. You didn't get that sort of group voting all at once kind of thing going on.
And for many people, that's their one day where they don't work. And if you're working 6 days a week and you've got kids and you're trying to manage all of that, and how do you get to work, how do you take time off, how do you get to the polls, etc. Sunday is a way that they have some leisurely time to actually go out and participate in the democracy.
Well, so we know voter identification is because there are all these people impersonating me. But what's the reason that I shouldn't be able to have a lot more days to vote early, or I shouldn't be able to go on Sunday? What's the rationale behind those?
I don't know that I've actually heard rationale behind that. It's just simply our laws that are being implemented. To be honest with you,
how foolish of me!
I'm not sure why they would. why they would do that.
Well, you know, voting is such a basic right. And you hear people so often talk about the fact that we don't have really great voting percentages.
Right.
I mean, it's really fairly bad. In Virginia this last year, we had like a 30% voting, which was awful. And we get better in the presidentials, and I know in the Obama year, we had in 2008, we had massive voting going on all over the country. And it would seem we would want to be encouraging people to vote so that it's actually the majority of the people making the decisions.
We should be making it easier for people to get to the polls, not creating new barriers and ways to try and stop them, or new hurdles that they have to jump over in order to get there to be able to vote. And it's a challenge, and I think it's one of the greatest threats to our democracy in our lifetime is this sweeping range of voter suppression laws that is just working its way across the country, legislature by legislature, in the states. And it's a great threat to what is going on. We really need to be focusing on how we can turn back these laws that are being implemented, try to lessen the impact that they have if they are being implemented in these states, and there isn't anything that we can do in the interim until they're overturned. You know, and by that it's, you know, educating the public on what the requirements are, finding ways in which those individuals can we can help them get to the places and get the documentation that they need to get the ID. You know, but that's a huge amount of energy that is going to have to be used by mostly nonprofit organizations that are out there. Some states are doing the education piece, but again, it's kind of here and there, and you know, who are they targeting, and how much of that information really does get out. And you think about it, if you're at home and you're sitting there and you normally vote or whatever, but suddenly you're hearing on the news that, you know, oh, well, now you have to go get an ID, but I don't have that, so I need to go, you know, get my birth certificate, but I don't know where that is. And, you know, how many people, we find people that are having issues with this right now, but I wonder how many people are just going to hear that and say, I just don't have the time or the energy in my life right now to be able to do that.
Right, and I think there's probably a lot of folks, because as I think about it, I couldn't begin to tell you where my birth certificate is. I'm not sure I've ever seen my birth certificate, to tell you the truth. Right. But I have a passport, so apparently that might do.
Right.
And at least we in Virginia, in the last kind of couple seconds we have, there are some states where if they pass this law, it has to have Department of Justice clearance.
Right.
It's the Section 5 issue.
Correct. The Voting Rights Act says that Section 5 is pre-cleared by either the Department of Justice or the Circuit Court in the U.S. District Court.
Well, and for those of us who read these kinds of articles in the paper, we know Eric Holder was enormously criticized, the Attorney General, for saying, I guess it was South Carolina's that didn't pass muster, so we can only hope. I want to thank you so much, Tim, for coming over and talking with us about this, and we will check back with you later and see how it all goes. Thank you all for watching, and we will see you at the next edition of Inside Scoop, Virginia Politics.